We will now recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Baldwin, for a round of questions.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the testimony of Thomas Gibson from the American Iron and Steel Institute on the bill.
Good. Without objection, so ordered. Thank you.
Tia, I appreciated your testimony and telling us a little bit about the real diversity among the stakeholders on Governor Doyle's task force on global warming, and the fact that you were able to reach near consensus on a number of recommendations that you note are similar to the provisions contained in the draft discussion bill before us. We've also taken in this committee testimony from representatives of U.S. CAP that had a similarly diverse array of stakeholders, and they were also able to reach substantial agreement around a blueprint for taking action on climate change. And I see similarities when I look across the Congress and this committee in terms of the diversity of interests and diversity of districts that we represent. So in many ways, we have a similar task immediately before us in trying to gather support and gain a majority. While we'd love to have a nearly unanimous vote in this committee on climate change legislation, I think we'll be happy if we get a good majority vote on this. But I wonder if you can tell us about your year-long experience leading the Governor's Task Force on Global Warming with these diverse stakeholders, how they were able to come together to reach a set of goals and reduction targets that satisfied so many varied perspectives, and if you could tell us particularly what were some of the key issues that you had to surmount and the perhaps significant points of contention that you were able to overcome.
Yes, thank you for your question. Part of our success was I think we just fatigued everyone. We were at it for, and I see that Chairman Markey is pursuing the same strategy, so I wish him a lot of luck. We originally set to meet for 9 months. We met for well over a year, and it was a difficult process. I think everyone came to the table in good faith, which obviously helped quite a bit. Ultimately, what we did, and I give enormous credit to my co-chair for this particular strategy, after listening to multiple stakeholders about multiple strategies, agreeing that we wanted strong targets, recognizing that we would need to dramatically increase investments in conservation and efficiency and renewables to meet those targets, and then realizing that we couldn't without a cap-and-trade program. It became clear to Roy and I that we were going to have to put in front of the group, in essence, a straw man proposal that we hoped was delicately balancing the trade-offs between constituencies without compromising the environmental integrity of our product, our report, which the governor accepted in its entirety. I failed to mention before, and which is going to be introduced hopefully in the legislature. We're drafting it now in the fall. For industry, manufacturing, utilities, the cost containment issue was huge. So the way we kept them on board was a very frank, recognition that Wisconsin will have challenges in competitiveness as a heavy coal-dependent, heavy manufacturing, and our manufacturing sector tend to be more energy intensive. We have to be extremely sensitive to global competitiveness. And so by paying a lot of attention to the cost containment measure, we moved our RPS up, our existing RPS, and then increased it 2.5-fold, the same as in the chairman's draft bill, 25 by 25. So really the compromise for the environmentalists, the cap and the integrity of the cap was essential. And for industry, it was essential to have, to recognize that Wisconsin's in a very economically vulnerable position, being so heavily dependent on coal. And this allocation proposal that we came up with that allows for a transition. This is just for a limited period of time that allows us to transition. Really, that allocation got us where we needed to go.
Thank you. I have a question. I will say that I have very limited knowledge on the market structure discussion, but I find it incredibly important on this. And so maybe you can help me understand it better. I'll start with Mr. Anda, and certainly Mr. Royal can comment on this. As I understand the futures market, you have hedgers and speculators. You have people who would want to possess futures on carbon that might actually use them someday because they're emitters. And then you have those who just want to be a part of this market. Do we treat these two groups differently? Do you propose that we do? And how do we, especially with speculators, what sort of safeguards would you advise us to build into this market as we develop it?
Well, I'll let Carl perhaps handle the point about speculators, but it's important that the market be open to all. The 2 points that I wanted to make are, number one, let's have that derivative trading in a place where we can see it, not over the counter, but on listed transparent exchanges, number one. And number two, mark-to-market accounting is fine for financial institutions and hedge funds. They do that anyway. But let's create something for the covered entities where they can effectively cover their carbon risk using futures and options, because we might not give them many allowances to bank. Let's let them use those instruments, and if their intention is to submit for compliance, let's have accounting for them that in effect is special, because they would treat this as a deferred expense, whereas a speculator would mark to market.
Just very briefly, you do need to have speculators in the market, otherwise called liquidity providers, because when somebody wants to buy, you need somebody on the other side to be the seller, or else you don't have a market. In terms of treating them differently, I think you can. I mean, for example, in the area of position limits, an emitter would need to have a larger quantity of allowances because, you know, it actually needs it for its business, whereas a speculator is doing it just to provide liquidity for the market, and so wouldn't need to have such a large limit. And I think the regulatory agency could, you know, establish different standards for those different types of market participants.
Do you have any early guidance on us on what sort of position limits we would be looking at?
I don't know the market well enough to how it's going to develop to be able to answer that. I think that's probably an area that might be delegated to the agency that's in charge of the market.
Okay.
I would just comment that the exchanges today do a pretty good job of setting limits because their members don't want to create excessive risk within the exchange. So where things get onto exchanges, you know, things tend to avoid blow-ups. When they're off exchange, that's a different story.
My colleague Andy Stevenson was in the same field as these gentlemen. In our written testimony, we recommended 5% position limits in the futures for any given vintage of a future delivery date, and with an adjustment that if an emitter has the kind of need that Mr. Royal suggested, that they might be holding 5% above their own needs. But a 5% seems to be an adequate amount in our judgment.
Okay, gentlelady's time has expired. Let me turn to you, Ms. Mulroy, and I'm very intrigued by your blue bank idea. I had testimony from the mayor of Philadelphia recently, and he talked about the need for some way of dealing with his water supply problem and the protection of his watershed. Could you tell me how, let's say, for Philadelphia's purposes, a blue bank might work to deal with those two problems?
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm not as familiar with Philadelphia as I am with New York, who share a similar concern to Philadelphia, and actually are a member of the climate coalition that 8 of us have formed in the United States. For them, the question is increased flooding will contaminate reservoirs that today feed New York City and do not require treatment. At some point in time, they're going to have to build treatment facilities, which will cost them billions of dollars for treating water they've never had to treat before. Because as those flood flows increase, it will contaminate those reservoirs.
So how would the Blue Bank then work for New York City?
For the Blue Bank, let's say in the case of New York, would help them finance those treatment plants to protect New York City and allow them to build them in a timely fashion and not sit through 3 years of a boil order in New York after the contamination has occurred.
Interesting. So just so I can understand a little bit about this concept that you have, does it have a coalition behind it, or is this an idea that you have personally?
No, there's a coalition of water agencies in the United States behind it. I think all of us, whether we're in Florida, whether we're in New York, or whether on the West Coast, know that the way we've been managing water resources for the last 100 years is obsolete. And whether it's investments in helping our communities make changes, investments in conservation that we can capitalize, or whether it's new facilities because our water supplies are either being contaminated or disappearing before our eyes, we know we're facing those challenges.
Okay, good. Thank you. Mr. Ander and Mr. Royal, let's take the European marketplace right now and talk a little bit about how the price of a carbon credit has fluctuated between $40 a euro and $6 or $8 a euro. Is that a good thing, a bad thing, or that's the way the market works, and it's better than the government making decisions about where the price should be in differing economic circumstances? Mr. Royal.
Yes, I mean, I'm not familiar with that exact market, but I think in general, I mean, markets do go up and down, and that's one of their functions. I think in this context, it could even serve a useful purpose because it would be counter-cyclical, because in times of booming economies, you'd expect more demand for the allowances, and that would tend to increase prices at a time when it could be afforded, whereas in times like we're having now where industries are closing plants, you'd have a less need and less demand for the allowances, which would then tend to drive the price down. So in a way, having a market-based mechanism would be self-correcting and would help smooth out some of these economic cycles.
See, that's how I view markets, but, some people would say that's an indication of a market not working, but I would basically argue that that's a perfect example of the market working. Mr. Ander, your comment?
I just think two things. First of all, to highlight the point about the major factor in the market is the global economic recession. If you look in the EPA's recent work on evaluating your draft discussion, there was an interesting chart in there that showed that in 2006, our business as usual reference scenario for emissions in the U.S. was we were going to go from 6 billion to over 8 billion. The current numbers go from 6 billion to about 6.25 billion. So think about the impact. We've really changed our assumptions about how much we're going to emit without policy. Well, those same factors have driven prices down in Europe. Point number one. Point number two, let's not forget that the European market ends on the last day of 2012. And so while allowances are bankable into the next period, we don't really know what the next period is going to be. So I don't think it's fair. The world emits, as you know, 30 billion tons of emissions from CO2. A little over 2 billion are covered in the European trading system. They were bold enough to start with a small market. When we come in, I think we'll have less volatility in a bigger market.
Thank you. Mr. Doninger.
If I may add 2 points to that, in partial response also to Ann Smith's comments about volatility. The $40 mark was hit at a point in the early experiment with the EU when they received for the first time accurate information about emission levels. In other words, they started their program without full information about how much was being emitted in the first place, and there was a systemic overestimate of how many emissions there were going to be, and people paid more for the allowances on the basis of that. When the data came in, there was an adjustment. This problem will not happen here because we already have much better data about actual emissions from the power sector, and thanks to the EPA's proposal of a more comprehensive emissions inventory system, even in advance of your legislation, we're going to have much better information across the board when the program starts. The other thing is, as John was just mentioning, if a program comes to an end, then there's a possibility that the allowances become valueless near the end. And that's the advantage of your sketching out a long-term carbon budget with a declining cap. And since there'll be long-term continuity, there won't be that problem of the program coming to an end or appearing to come to an end, and people having the doubt about what the allowances are worth.
There's very little likelihood of the European program coming to an end either. So let me go to you, Mr. Kovacs. Some of the members on the Chamber Board, Duke Energy, Alcoa, testified before this committee earlier this week. And while your board represents a broad coalition, it appears that many and possibly most of your members support a domestic policy that would set goals and the means for reducing the overall levels of U.S. global warming pollution. How do you reconcile the Chamber's position with those of some of the firms that sit on the Chamber board who are testifying before our committee asking us to pass a cap-and-trade bill?
Well, I guess excuse me, I guess I thought you'd never ask. Look, we within our federation, we have roughly about 3.5 million members, 3,000 state and local chambers, and 1,000 trade associations. That's an enormous difference. So when we analyze a bill like yours, for example, and it was an example I used today, let's just take the application of new source performance review. You have one group, which is relatively small in numbers, 30, that would sit there and literally be exempt from the new source performance review because of the caps. Then you'd have a second tier of thousands of members that would be subject to it, and then you have the 26 million small businesses out there that in some way have no idea whether they're going to be subject or not, but could be challenged. And every one would be hit by an attorney's fees. So what we try to do is we take the entire policy, we apply our principles to what it is you're trying to do, and we make a determination of whether or not it meets those principles, which are, does it harm the economy? Does it promote competitiveness? Does it accelerate technology? Do we have enough energy in the environment? And how is it going to affect the international structure? And that's how we do it.
Is the Chamber willing to come forward with proposals that tell us what they would be comfortable with as the regulatory scheme?
Thought you never asked. We actually had a debate on this issue today, 3 hours, where we had the proponents of a carbon tax, the proponents of a cap and trade representing U.S. cap, and a third way. And we had quite a spirited discussion. And frankly, it was probably the most optimistic discussion I've had. I don't know that I'm free to tell you the results, but there certainly was a lot of talk and a lot of willingness to find out how it is we get reductions in a way that helps the economy.
Okay, great. And in your statement that Congress should not mandate the use of technologies before they actually exist, we don't have any mandates for any specific technologies in the legislation. So I was just wondering what you're referring to.
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, probably the biggest issue that we care about is that we don't think you can get enough energy back in the system to substitute for what you're going to take out. I'll give you an example. Clean coal, the Bard facility in Ohio. Here was an example where they went through the DOE loan guarantee process. They literally got all of their permits. They were about to break ground, and then they were notified by several environmental groups that they were going to sue. DOE then decided that the risk of that lawsuit was so great they were going to pull the loan guarantees. And this is clean coal. And so what happened is the company walked away from the project. And if that was the only project, we probably wouldn't care. But we've right now looked, and we've only been doing this a month, we've got about 300. And I mean, there are other, it's not just energy. The other day we had a presentation on cell towers, and someone said, well, there are 800 of them on hold because of this. This is a big issue, and we have to deal with it. And we got a lot of cooperation on the stimulus plan when we started offering, how do we move this through? We wanted a time limit, and Senator Boxer and Senator Barrasso finally came to an agreement that we would use the most expedited route. But this is an issue that I think if you can solve and start making us feel like we're going to have real energy in in this country, and it's not going to get stopped, you're going to then find that some of our major concerns are really starting to be addressed.
Again, we're not mandating any particular technology in the legislation. Although, but I would say this to you in terms of kind of an extension of the optimistic meeting which you had today. Were you in two places at once, or how did that work today for you?
That was from 8:30 to 12. I'm not closing in on the number of years of hearings that you've had. But
No, I'm just
there.
saying is I thought that you might be, ubiquitous and omniscient. You know what I mean? Kind of like super, Chamber of Commerce. In 2008, there were about 9,500 new megawatts of natural gas capacity installed in the United States. There was about 1,500 new megawatts of coal installed in the United States. But the really, I think, kind of O. Henry ending to this is that while there was no new nuclear, there hasn't been for 15 years, and there won't be for another 10 years because it takes that long to build a new plant, there were 8,500 new megawatts of wind installed in the United States in 2008, 400 new megawatts of solar, 150 new megawatts of geothermal, and 100 new megawatts of biomass. So that's 9,000, more than 9,000 new megawatts from renewables. In other words, 45% of all new installed capacity in the United States in 2008 were renewables. And that's before we pass a national renewable electricity standard. That's before we build in incentives for a low-carbon economy. So while we're not mandating any specific new technology, it's obvious that the technologies are there and would be improved as the economies of scale kicked in as the market grew larger and larger over the years. So I'm a little bit, perhaps, more of an optimist because of my own experience with the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which I introduced in 1993 before this committee. After it finally passed in 1996, we went from a point where not one home in America had broadband in 1996, not one home, to a point where 10 years later there's a whole new vocabulary. YouTube, Google, eBay, Amazon, Hulu, thousands of companies, millions of new jobs. They didn't exist, of course, because the market wasn't there before 1996 for broadband. It was all narrowband. So here we're talking about the same kind of a situation where there was an equivalent copper wire that we just had to move to digital. We had to move to broadband. We had to move to fiber optic. Well, here we have another copper wire for electricity in America. And it really hasn't been improved upon. And I agree with the chairman when he says, we might go back like 70 or 80 years. And the truth is that Thomas Alva Edison would recognize our electricity grid if he came back today. We need a revolution. But I think that the problem that I have with the Chamber is that the Chamber opposed the Telecom Act of 1996, okay? And it was basically making the same arguments. It was making the same arguments about how, basically, how do you move from a black rotary dial phone to a world where everyone's got devices in their pockets and you have all these new, companies that are going to be created. And so you're right, it does take a little bit of a leap, but a leap based upon our own American experience with technology and the entrepreneurial spirit. So my hope is that the meeting that you had today, will lead to a more optimistic view about what the private sector can do when a new marketplace is created and unleash the opportunities for thousands of companies that will be created, that will create a whole new vocabulary 10 years from now when people look back at this antiquated energy system which we have. And by the way, I would include in that a carbon capture a system that probably won't look anything like anyone is talking about today, and probably involve enzymes and acetic acids that are, reformulating just the way in which coal is burned and turning it into a positive product. But we've got to get on with that business, Mr. Kovacs, and I really urge the Chamber to, just look back at its own history, especially with the Telecommunications Act and opposing that.
Do you want me to respond to the telecom
no, please,
issue?
Yes, please.
On the telecom issue, first of all, I wasn't there, but my recollection is, especially as it had gone into broadband, is that they didn't want regulation on it because the wire system, as being a regulated system, was drying up, and they needed a non-regulated system to put in the $150 billion in investment. Here in this act, all I'm trying to say is you have got a structure here which layers cap and trade, and then you, in two capacities, then you have regulations, then you have litigation. What I'm saying is that I don't know that that structure will work. And the fact that you've got 8,500 new megawatts of wind capacity, that's wonderful. What we're saying is to get to the 10%, you need 115,000. That's a long leap, and it's a lot of land mass, and it's a lot of litigation.
Can I say this? It's really not a big leap. If you just take us from now to 2025, and you add just, well, it's actually 9 total, and just go 9 times 15 years or 16 years, we've got the number. That's if we don't do any better between now and 2025. If we just keep the pace that we are at right now before we pass a national law, right? 9 times 16. So all I'm saying to you, Mr. Kovacs, is it's just such a rearview mirror view of what technology can accomplish. If we look out the windshield towards the future, just using 2008 as the metric, we wind up doing it, creating the jobs here, and just revolutionizing our nation's relationship with imported oil and with greenhouse gases. So that's really all in a lot of ways, we do need the Chamber of Commerce to look at this and to look at it optimistically and to realize that the benefits will flow right across the whole society. And I'll just give you one other example, and I won't hold you beyond that. I'm going to ask each one of you to give us the 30 seconds you want us to remember about your testimony. But here, and I was the chairman, we moved over 200 megahertz of spectrum in 1993. Why did we do that? We took it from the Defense Department. We gave it over to the Department of Commerce because there were only 2 cell phone companies in the United States. They were both analog. They were both charging 50 cents a minute. They both projected relatively limited American use of cell phones. Obviously, at 50 cents a minute, there weren't a lot of people going to be carrying that around in their pocket, huh? So what we did was we moved over the spectrum, but said for the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th license in every marketplace, from Philadelphia to Las Vegas, they couldn't be owned by the first 2 companies. Well, guess what the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th companies did? They went digital. By 95, their price was under 10 cents a minute, and the first 2 companies, guess what? They both had to go digital. And they were both under 10 cents a minute. And then it was a race on to see, can we put pictures on that phone? Can we put data on that phone? Can we have a huge basket of minutes? And here we are today, all walking around with everyone in this room with 1 or 2 devices in their pocket. None of it possible before that. So I guess what I'm saying to you, and really what I would say to everybody who's interested in this issue, is that with just a little bit of optimism, not looking at some rocket science of putting a man on the moon, but just what's already happening in America. If we gave the right boost to it, we could have this revolution just so far exceed anything that we're even talking about today. That's what happened in the telecommunications sector, both wireless and wireline. And I think if we give people a chance in a new marketplace, that the same thing will happen, Mr. Kovacs. So that's my message, and I just hope that it's received in the Darwinian, paranoia-inducing, market-oriented way that we're going to try to construct this bill and put in the right market protections, transparency, anti-fraud, anti-manipulation, and then just step back the way we did after 1996, and we don't know who the winners and losers are going to be. We don't know if there's going to be a 9X or a Bell Atlantic. or a Southern or a Bell South. All we know is that the companies that win will be the ones that adapt quickly. And that's how it should be in our country, really Darwinian. And in a lot of ways, I hate to say it, that's what we're talking about for our planet, too. You know, it's a real challenge for us in this Darwinian moment that we can adapt, that we can put in place the incentives that make people rich while we're also protecting the planet. So we'll come back to you, Ms. Nelson, and we will give you an opportunity for 30 seconds to tell us what it is that you want us to remember.
Thank you, sir. You deserve the Endurance Prize. I am grateful for your interest. My message is simple. Help states like Wisconsin mitigate costs without compromising the integrity of the emission reduction goal, and we'll be your partner in finding a climate change solution.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Mr. Becker.
Thank you. I have 3 points to make. The first is that you and Congressman Waxman and others who worked in this bill should be very proud of your efforts. It's a very good bill. Second point is, as you know full well, this was a compromise, and yet this will probably be the high water mark before this gets signed into law. It's going to undergo significant change, and it's going to get weaker. And the third point is, in light of that, it's very important that you strengthen the federal, state, local partnership and preserve the rights of states and localities to not only fill whatever gaps exist, but to be able to address emerging problems in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Becker. Mr. Royal.
I'll be very brief.
Could you move in closer to the microphone, please?
In a cap and trade market, it's essential that Congress create a regulatory framework that protects the integrity of the market and ensures that the market achieve its environmental purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Royal. Mr. Anda.
3 technical comments and 1 other. Increase the initial float. Think about a central marketplace to get your best execution requirement, the CLOB for carbon I talked about, and make sure that emitters can use the exchange-traded derivatives that you want to create. Lastly, I'd just say I heard a lot of testimony today. Chairman Markey, I hope that you're in a position, as Mr. Gore was this morning, to be a witness. Your comments are great. I think they should be, I'd like to see them expanded in a nice half-hour format, and good luck to you in your work.
Thank you, Mr. Anda, very much. Mr. Doniger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What this committee is doing is writing the next generation of the Clean Air Act. And we have the existing Clean Air Act and what you're doing. We need them both, and we need these things to merge, and it can be done in a way that makes for an effective carbon control program and an integrated system that takes advantage of the best of the clean air laws that we have already.
Thank you. Sir. Ms. Mulroy.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we in the water industry, many of us have been anxiously awaiting this day where we in this country take this issue of climate change head on and begin to make the necessary changes. For us, because it's a decadal issue, we will feel the impacts, and we are looking for assistance for research, which is so desperately needed to quantify those implications, and in making the necessary adaptations that we have to make. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Smith.
2 points. First, get back to cost minimization by stripping out the prescriptive and redundant measures so that market-based approach can work in its Darwinian glory, and by incorporating features that provide price predictability so that you can unleash those investments. Second, I'd like to correct the record. The prices in the EU did go up in the range of $40 a ton twice, once during the early phase and second time just about a year ago. So it's not just a phenomenon of the learning phase. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And Mr. Kovacs, you have the final word of our historic hearings.
Well, thank you for your good humor, if nothing else. Just wanted to say the success of broadband was really due a lot to what you did, but also you didn't regulate it. And I think that that's something we need. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a regulatory system here, but if you're going to do it, it needs to be transparent, understandable. You need to avoid overlapping and confusing regulatory structures between the Clean Air Act and whatever it is you're going to do. You need to find some way to limit litigation so we can get the projects moving. And I think at the end you need to appreciate the fact that if we're really going to reduce GHGs in the atmosphere, we have to have some way in which to engage the international community. And we would suggest that the way to do that is an international treaty.
Thank you, Mr. Kovacs, very much. The paradox of telecommunications regulation and regulation here is that you actually need new regulations in order to undo all of the old regulations that protected industries against change. And that's the paradox. That is, in order to create a truly competitive marketplace that just doesn't play into the needs of the largest utilities, whether they be telephone, cable, or electric utilities, because all of the laws have been written on their behalf at the state and federal level for 100 years, you actually have to create a whole new set of laws, of regulations that ensure that the smaller, distributed competitors can then begin to deploy their technologies. That's the paradox. But ultimately, you wind up with many, many more, thousands of additional competitors in trying to provide information services, or here, they will be energy and efficiency services for our country. And so that's kind of the paradox here. And while it seems as though we're regulating, what we're really doing is undoing the regulatory protection that was given to these industries for 100 years, while the assumption of monopoly on the wires was taken for granted, when in fact, it's just the opposite if you change the regulatory dynamic. So that's what we're trying to do in this legislation. We've already done it in telecommunications. We've done it in cable. And this is the final wire going into the home. This is the final set of issues that we have to deal with across the board. And if we do it, then we can get out of the way, because people's interest in becoming millionaires and billionaires will completely trump anything that we can do, because they'll be out turning green into gold all across our country with their new technologies and their deployment. This has been a historic set of hearings. We thank all of you for your participation, and please stay close to us over the next month or so. We're going to need your ongoing advice. Thank you.